tension between white and black Americans has always been high since the time of slavery. After the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans were free from slavery but still had restricted rights. Jim Crow laws and the Supreme Court ruling of Plessy v. Ferguson, which ruled that African Americans were separate but equal, helped restrict African American rights. African Americans also had to deal with hate groups like the KKK, which would attack African Americans personally in their homes and in their communities. African Americans would not take this injustice sitting down. They helped start organizations to fight for their rights. Organizations such as the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, which started in 1909 to help start the fight for African American rights. Organizations like the NAACP helped start the civil rights movement, but it didn't really gain momentum until after World War II. Civil rights groups like the NAACP and the SCLC, or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was led by Martin Luther King Jr., started organizing protests and boycotts across the country to help fight for civil rights. Martin Luther King Jr. and many other civil rights groups taught civil disobedience. Civil disobedience meant protesting peacefully with ways that would disturb the social norms, like long marches, sit-ins, and boycotts. Some of the most famous acts of civil disobedience would be the Million Man March, the March to Selma, and the Montgomery bus boycotts, which was a reaction to the arrest of Rosa Parks. Civil disobedience worked to the advantage of African Americans because if police or angry white Americans tried to break up the protests violently, then media would capture it and broadcast the violence to the nation. Not all African Americans believed in civil disobedience. Malcolm X was a big advocate for violence as a way of self-defense and to further the civil rights cause. He was a leader of a black Muslim group and taught that whites could not be trusted. But later in his career, he changed his mind, but was soon assassinated after. Another group that advocated for violence was the Black Panther Party. The Black Panthers preached more revolutionary ideas and had more extreme ideas than Malcolm X. Due to protests and court cases, African Americans made a lot of progress during the Civil Rights Movement, from desegregation of schools in 1954 to the Civil Rights Act, which was signed into law in 1946. The Civil Rights Act helped protect African Americans and other minorities against discrimination at work and in the community. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act helped protect African Americans against laws that discouraged African Americans from voting. Even after the civil rights bills were signed into law, there was still a lot of racism in the community towards African Americans. For example, white parents would stop a bus full of African American students simply because they did not want their children to go to school with a black child. The civil rights movement not only gave African Americans the rights they deserved, but it also showed the power of protesting and civil disobedience. The effects of the civil rights movement still has an impact today, as you can look at the similarities between the Black Lives Matter movement and other powerful movements that fought for equality, just like the civil rights movement. Society is still learning a lot from the civil rights movement, and race relations are still developing and growing. But the future looks optimistic.